Okay, good morning. It's early. I'm actually leaving later than I wanted to. But it's about 5:36 a.m. I need to get in and get out today because I've got some things to do. So I'm gonna go a little bit off the cuff. I have a couple of things I know I want to say. I should have really kind of like thought about this. Um, and I should have done this video with more attention, I guess. So I want to talk about being light skinned for a second. All right. Um, Oftentimes, let me just say this first, and then I'll talk about it. Oftentimes, people will say like, "Oh, you think you're this, you think you're that." People try to tell you what you think. You think you're this because you're light skinned. So, in previous videos, do you remember me mentioning that when Amanda Seals made that comment. Now, she didn't hyper focus on that for the entire like interview. When she made that comment, and I know how it like triggered me for a second, right? Oh, I don't know. She said, I don't like you because you're light skinned or something like that. That's what she's been told. So many people will have been told that. People will have been said, oh, you think you're this. They try to tell you what you think because they're in your mind. Now, I'm going to tell you the reason why in the beginning I didn't think anything growing up, it's not that I've never heard comments about being light or anything like that, but it wasn't really that common for me, or I really was kind of oblivious to it because we didn't really grow up like that. I was aware of black and white because I lived in mixed environments. Now, I'm talking about what my understanding was back when I was a kid. That's not to say that people didn't have, subconscious biases, like whether you're white, black, or not, right? So that doesn't mean that maybe even a white person didn't have a subconscious bias towards light skinned people versus dark skinned people. What I am saying is, I was aware of black and white. Yes, I knew about this thing called being light skinned, but it wasn't like a thing for me because I grew up knowing that I was a black child. Um, that doesn't mean I didn't experience the other stuff, but it just wasn't really super common for me. When I went to college, get myself together here, make sure everybody's playing nicely out here on these streets. Hopefully the video doesn't start getting weird because I know I go through bad spots. So when I was in college, I had some ignorance, and I'll tell you why. I used to show up every day in our quad-ish looking area, and finally, well, what happened was there was a guy that used to say, "What's up, Fred?" And I didn't know he was talking to me because I had never heard of the term red or red bone. I had never heard of that. Never. I've heard of yellow, high yellow, light skinned, or light skinned. I've heard of those things. Never heard of red. And I'm not red. But he used to say, "What's up, red?" And I never knew he was talking to me. So what happened was, I would walk by him. I thought he was talking to somebody else. So you know what that does, right? You're now that light skinned, stuck up chick. So I never heard of that. So eventually he comes out. He's like, "So you know how to speak or something?" I'm like, "What? What do you mean? What are you talking about?" I always say hi to you all the time. I'm like, "You've been saying hi to me?" And long story short, it comes out that he's like, "Yeah, so like, every time I say what's up, Red, blah, blah, blah." And I'm like, "What? Why are you calling me that?" And we went through the whole conversation. He's like, "What? What do you mean what?" I'm like, "What? What are you talking about?" So he proceeds to tell me how what that was. I was like, I had no idea. So now I want to make sure you guys understand as far as when you start thinking in terms of light skin and dark skin, where I was coming from before I, I move into my future stuff. I had never heard of that term before. Never. So all this time, homie is saying hi. And trust me, by the way, he was not checking for me because He was into women who did not look like me. You know what I'm talking about. But he used to always say that to me. And I was like, what? And so oftentimes what happened was people used to say, like, oh, like the people who look like me were like, oh, we thought you were just stuck up. You didn't want to talk to us. I'm like, why would you think that? You're like, well, you never spoke. I'm like, well, did you speak to me? So it was this whole big misunderstanding. Now, many of my friendships in my first year or two were with a bunch of people who did not look like me. Well, I had classes with them, I had activities with them, et cetera, et cetera. My best friend in college was a white male. I went to a predominantly white male college. My degree is in engineering, so most of us were there for something technical, of course. But my specialty, my actual degree was materials science engineering. Okay, so there was no one who was black in my major. I was me by myself. Me. Now, the first couple of years, you're taking just regular classes, so you can be in regular gen ed classes with everybody. The point I'm making with all of this, because we're going to talk about the whole skin tone thing. In the beginning, like you hear these concepts, but nothing really resonated with me because growing up, I primarily just associated myself with being a black woman. Okay? It wasn't like a thing until I left home, how people started to distinguish who I was in categorization. So now, here I am learning all these things. And most, believe it or not, most of my beauty at the time, and I say that with earmarks, even though I dated black men, but most of my beauty was affirmed by white men in college. Now, what you think about that? Predominantly white male school. I'm around them all the time, but the only ones I dated were black. There wasn't that many of us there, but most of my beauty was affirmed by white men. I want you to let that one sink in. I didn't know any different because see, when I went to college, I was still really skinny. I hadn't really grown into, you know, my situations. So I didn't know anything about this whole colorism thing. Like at least not when I was coming up. It wasn't being named. It wasn't something that was named. Now it was as I had gotten older. I've come through. Like my sophomore, junior, senior year in college, I started to understand there's this thing like people were like hyper focused on skin tone. And I went to school in the north. I did not know skin tone was that like skin color was that big of a thing. Because in my mind, we were all black people. And I'm going to be honest, I wasn't wrong. But not understanding colorism was a level of ignorance. Now I'm going to tell you, you know, I'm going to stuttering and carrying on, you know, as I grew to understand colorism, because I was kind of like late to the game, right? Because remember, I was being affirmed by white men. They wanted to take care of me more than black dudes. So, I never really ever was called light skinned or anything like that by some white guy. I wasn't. They didn't even refer to me as black. To be honest, I was just a person. Now, do they recognize the fact that I was black? I mean, I'm not going to be naive. Of course they did. I mean, we were like close friends. Like, not, hey, get your mind out together, not those kind of friends. Although they probably wanted to be that kind of friend too. We were really close friends. Now, we're going to fast forward for a second while I still have time. And if I run out of time, I'll do a part two. As I was, you know, coming through college, and now I'm starting to understand this thing about skin, right? Because in yesterday's video, I told you about the girl T, or maybe it was 2 days ago, whatever day it was that I did that video on, you know, I'm finding out that like she had issues with her skin color, and she tried to say I was I like ladies. Um, she tried to say all those things, and it was all based off of the fact that she liked some guy who didn't like her but liked me, and I didn't even know that the guy liked me. I'm hanging out with predominantly white guys, and I got a supposedly black boyfriend. It was just a hot mess. I was still not quite growing into my full womanhood yet. I was giving off Jimmy Woodchuck vibes. And at the time in college, I want you guys to listen. I mean, this all comes together. You know, at the time, most of the people I hung around were these. It were people who did like look like me. Well, primarily because that's who I had to study with. Although I had my black friends. Don't get me wrong. I'm still going to hang around with my peoples, right? But they weren't in my major. I was also in ROTC, and I also played a sport. I didn't see them as much. Now, as I had gotten older, I learned from black people about skin tone. Black people were the most treacherous people. I still love my people, but they were horrible. You learn so much. Mm. I go into the military. You guys know the story about the one who was like, it's people like you who, you know, if you saw that video. And from that moment on, that's when I started understanding this colorism thing, right? But this is the thing. Let me tell you how I actually perpetuated it for a little while. You know when people say you don't have the range to have these conversations? During that time frame, I don't know if I had the range to have those conversations. I'm not sure. I probably could have had the conversation, but I didn't know how to name it. And the only way you get range is to go get range, right? So I didn't know how to name it. In the beginning, I didn't know how to name it, and I sure as heck didn't stop it. I did not do anything to stop colorist behaviors and comments. I did nothing. Because one, I was still coming to understand what it was. Number two, it was a heavy lift. Number three, think about it. I am now preferred. So in these white environments, I always just understood myself as a black woman. I knew that they liked me, but I was not really interested in engaging in those kinds of relationships because it just seemed too hard, right? I wanted black relationships, but then when I get into these black relationships, I'm learning about what is preferred. And when I started to understand colorism, I didn't do anything to stop it. So now I want to pause right here for a second because I think everybody needs to hear this. When I say that we need to have everybody in the room to have these conversations, I meant that. Because the number people who look like me or who are biracial or whatever it is, they have to one be honest. And it's hard to be honest because it opens you up, right? Like you become a very vulnerable person. But you have to be honest. So when I say I did nothing in the beginning. I didn't have any tools. I was just now starting to understand it, and I was like, oh, I have this look or whatever that is preferred. And when you're young and in your prime dating stages, your prime mating, your prime everything, right? Now it supposedly leads out competition. Now, let me just say this. To be honest, I still really wasn't all that caught up in the whole color thing. And it couldn't be because I really wasn't brought up that way. But, okay, so I know this car does not think he's going to jump in front of me and cut me off. Sorry, I had to establish dominance for a second. And you know how the guys don't like that. You know, like, you got to stay in your feminine all the time. But I had to establish dominance. So, look, when I was coming up, like, I did not stop anything because I was barely able to name it. And I didn't really have any tools. Because now I'm getting like a crash course education. I can't talk. I'm getting an education, real life. It's like on the job training. So when I say you have to have these conversations with everybody in the room, you do have to have those conversations with everyone in the room. And it requires, for one, people who look like me to be honest. And you have to be vulnerable. But also, it requires people who are darker than me to be honest and be vulnerable. And you can express yourself without trying to harm someone in the process. And people who look like me, let me just say this. This is where I'm going to make everybody mad. We need to listen, but we also have to be heard. Because for me, when I first started out, I had no concept of this stuff. I had no concept of like, what's up, red? And I'm like, I'm not even red. It was one of those things. I was like, what is this? Like, I had never heard of the concept before. So then I was deemed stuck up. I don't like black people. She doesn't respond to when people speak to her, like all this stuff. I didn't even know they were talking to me. I thought they were talking to somebody else. Hey, what's up, Red? Like, why would I think that? I was never taught that. So what I'm saying is this: when at least for me, when I started to understand colorism in the beginning, I did nothing. I didn't do anything. I barely could name it. But it was like, oh, I mean, I was more along the lines of like, oh, I must have a really cool look at people. Child. I was like, duh. But I will say this. This is where I will push back on people. As I matured and started to understand things, I most definitely started questioning. So what happened was it started off with questions like, why do you say that? Well, why do you not consider this one to be whatever? Well, why won't you hire this person? When I think about when I was in college and I would watch black men in a in an academic setting, right? So remember, I still wasn't making the connections in the beginning because I didn't always see men being treated with a level of distinguishment, right? Did I make a word distinguishment? They weren't being distinguished in terms of light and dark. I remember watching young men, it was some maybe differential equations. I don't remember what class it was. I think it was differential equations. Don't remember. They the one guy, I just remember he was a light skinned guy. I think he had freckles and he had little twists in his hair, guess back then. And he went up to the professor to ask a question about something towards the end. Or maybe it was a TA. And the guy was leaning back like, I'm like, what is he leaning back for? Does he think he's gonna bite him? This was a light guy. I just remember he had some freckles and he was like a cool kid, but he had glasses that day. I don't want to say names, but um, I guess he needed to see for something for a second. He takes his glasses off. But anyway, he treated that guy the same as the darker skinned guys, right? So that's part of the reason why, like, it hadn't really resonated with me yet. I learned more about skin tone from black people than I did from white people. I watched black men get treated the same, whether they were light or dark. So to me, they were black. They weren't light skinned black men or dark skinned black men. They weren't that at all. They were just black men, which is why I felt like I was so late to the game. Because colorism doesn't just affect mating preferences, it affects hiring preferences, it affects inclusion in certain things, it affects just opportunities, it affects a lot of things. And so for me, in the beginning, I knew it. I just knew racism. I didn't understand colorism, and now we got featureism and all this other stuff like that. I didn't know. I didn't know. So that's the reason why I was so late to understanding it. And then when I started to get it, I did nothing because now I got to figure out how do I tackle this, right? And remember, I was preferred. I now realize, oh, I'm thinking it's just because they think I'm cute or something. Well, I always think I'm cute, right? But the point I'm getting at is when we talk about having these conversations, you can't do these things in a vacuum. I don't necessarily like to engage in the oppression Olympics. Like, oh my gosh, it was just so hard being like, there were times when, as a young adult, I caught, I caught it back in my fitter, finer younger days. I caught, you know what? Most of it from just some of the meanest, nastiest women I have ever. And I think the one that stood out the most was that woman that said, "It's people like you who make it hard like me." And I mean, she just went in. And what made it so bad was I looked up to her. I mean, like almost like big sister. Like I just here I am thinking she was like so beautiful and so smart, and she was funny, and she had the perfect body, everything. Because when you're young, that's all you know. I thought so highly of this woman, and the way she gutted me. I mean, that stuck with me for a long time because it's almost like seeing your childhood idol. I don't believe in idolizing people, but you know what I mean. And then you find out there's something else. I was so hurt by this woman. I didn't even talk to that chick. I didn't want any parts of that girl anymore. I used to hang out at her spot. We used to have game nights with all the young black officers. Because we used to do so much. I stopped hanging with her. And I found out one of the reasons why, because she liked somebody that liked me and some other stuff. And I didn't know she liked this man. But the way she went off on me, I was like, holy cow. Anyway, throughout my adulthood, I went through it with a lot of these ladies. And it got to the point where I didn't even want to be friends with a lot of people. I didn't, because there was, oh, geez, it's getting bright out here in these streets. Hold on a second. All right. So I didn't even want to be friends with these people. Look, those people. I didn't, because there were so many subversive things that started happening. Part of it was because I didn't really understand how I was showing up in this world. I was oblivious to things. You're going out, people want to talk to you and not them, not realizing they want to talk to the people. The whole thing was a mess. But I had to learn it. But I will say, in the beginning, I didn't stop anything. I just let it keep on happening because I was one of the preferred ones until I really got it. And then when I tried to go about things differently and figure out how do I dismantle this and have these hard conversations, and people still will just admit, I don't care, I like what I'm like, okay, well, and then you try to defend people, right? It was a process. And even the very people that I would try to defend would try to cause me extreme harm. I have way too many stories. I mean, it doesn't even matter at this point. But to experience that, it does take a toll. Now, I'm not asking for your sympathy. I don't need it. I just want to be clear, and you probably won't give it. But I wanted people to understand where I was coming from and understand these conversations cannot be had in a vacuum. It would require people who look like me to be vulnerable and be honest about some things. And it also will require dark-skinned women to get honest about some things too. But you can do it without being harmful. You can do it and extend some grace to people. And it's not going to be comfortable. It's not going to be comfortable. And there's a lot of assumptions that people make that aren't always true, because people are like, oh, you always do. I'm like, no, I literally didn't in the beginning. I was like, what are you talking about? What? But then when I became aware of it, I became aware of it. But anyway, so I think this is a good stopping point because I think maybe I'll get some gas right before I go inside. Um, I think this is a good stopping point. What do you guys think? And look, you guys are allowed to comment, Be respectful. You're gonna always have somebody who's gonna be a ding dong, but I will say this: if people are willing to have conversations and they're willing to be vulnerable and honest, then what you can't do is lambast them, right? Like they have to be able to feel safe, and I don't think a lot of people feel safe. But all right, go ahead, leave a comment. Go ahead and subscribe and watch all my videos, every single one of them, my videos. All right, until next time. Remember how amazing I am.